The Middle Ages, Russia. During the Middle Ages, Russia had a complicated system of succession in which lands were constantly being fought over. And it was unclear who was in charge. So there wasn't one clear ruler, and the succession of lands wasn't very clear either, so there was a lot of fighting amongst pretty much everybody. The Rurik dynasty controlled Kievan Russia from 862 to around 1240. Now, Kievan Russia was a Russia where Kiev was the center of government. It was pretty much their capital city. And there was still constant fighting among members of the Rurik family, which weakened their control. So even though one family had risen up to take control of Kievan Russia, they still fought amongst themselves, so their control was not very strong. Mongols invaded Russia from 1237 to 1240 and brought about the ultimate destruction of Kiev, which was the capital city, and the death of approximately half of Russia's population. So these Mongol hordes came in and they wreaked a lot of havoc. There was no clear control, and everyone was already fighting amongst themselves. They didn't have an organized army. So when the Mongols invaded, it took a while, about 3 years, but in the end, they destroyed Kiev, including everyone that lived there, and approximately half of Russia's population had been killed when the Mongols took over. The invading Mongols and their Turkic subjects, people who had joined with the Mongols from Turkic countries or states and decided to help them fight, all became known as the Tatars. And the Tatars formed the state of the Golden Horde. This is what they called themselves. And this is who controlled Russia for a while. They pillaged the Russian principalities. So since half the people were dead anyway, they could go through and pillage their belongings, and they still pillaged things from the Russians that were living there still. So the Russians really didn't care for the Tatars. It wasn't an amicable relationship where now they were okay with being under control of the Tatars, but they were such a strong adversary that there wasn't a lot that the Russian people could do about it. Now, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which is known as Muscovy in Western histories, was the most powerful successor state to Kievan Russia. So, Muscovy was still under the domain of the Tatars. The Tatars were still in control. They were still basically the owners of all the land, but the princes of Moscow connived with them to assert influence in central Russia in the 1300s. So now, government and power is going to be focused in Moscow. And the princes of Moscow kind of work with the Tatars and say, okay, you're in control, but let me just help you keep these lands in check. So the princes of Moscow are the ones who get to kind of control everything from the inside, while the Tatars are still technically in charge. And the princes of Moscow, under Muscovy, slowly reunited Russia's lands and began the expansion of Russia. So Russia was broken up. There was a lot of fighting before. Lands had been broken up and different people were saying they were in charge of different parts. Well, Muscovy said, okay, let's get everyone back together. Let's say we're all one country again. And slowly it grew. So once they had reunited all of Russia's lands, they also looked to expand Russia. Then, in 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow led all of the united Russian principalities to victory over the Tatars. And this was in the Battle of Kulikovo. And Moscow continued absorbing surrounding principalities. So Moscow, this is a Moscow-based Russia, where Kiev in Russia was based around Kiev. Now you've got Muscovy, which is a Russia that's centered around Moscow. And the princes of Moscow have been in charge. There's a clearer line of succession. Basically, it's going to be another prince of Moscow that's going to succeed whenever one dies or decides to step down. And it took a little while, over 100 years, but finally the Russians have kicked out or have had a victory over the Tatars. They are as strong as the Tatars. Then Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, also of Moscow, finally threw out the Golden Horde's control. He defeated them for good, and he consolidated all of central and northern Russia. So now all the parts of Russia, all principalities, are grouped together under Ivan III's control, based out of Moscow. Then, after Constantinople fell in 1453, Moscow claimed succession to the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire. Which was also known as the Byzantine Empire. So, Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. And when the capital fell, the Eastern Roman Empire pretty much fell apart, and Moscow claimed succession to those lands as well. So, Russia was still trying to expand, and it took in most of that land. This began a Russian empire led by czars, and is usually considered the end of the Middle Ages in Russia. So the Middle Ages for Russia started in a time when succession was very unclear, lands were constantly being disputed, and even whenever they found a central city of Kiev to center around and have the power and government pretty much coming out of there, the people in the Rurik family that formed the Rurik dynasty and were controlling Kiev in Russia were still fighting amongst themselves. They were taken over by the Mongols, and then the Grand Duchy of Moscow, also known as Muscovy, took control, and underneath the Tatars, rounded up everyone, reunited them, and under Ivan III's rule, they were finally able to throw out the Golden Horde completely. They took in what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire and expanded Russia much further. And at that time, in 1453, Russia was one united area, and Ivan III was in charge, and that was going to start the beginning of a Russian empire versus lots of little broken principalities in Russia.